In the time before time, when darkness held dominion over all existence and silence stretched across the void, the first stirrings of emergence began not with a single moment, but with a great awakening that would ripple across the continent in waves of divine possibility. The tales that arose from this awakening were not myths spun for entertainment, but living vessels of truth that carried within them the very essence of what it meant to exist in harmony with all manifestation. The cosmic wheel turned in the endless night, its 4 directions establishing the fundamental patterns that would govern all future reality. East brought the gift of new beginnings, the morning radiance that would pierce eternal shadow. South offered the warmth of growth and transformation. West provided the wisdom of endings that made space for rebirth. North stood as the keeper of ancient knowledge, where understanding crystallized into eternal truth. At the center, where all directions converged, the first pulse of Genesis began to beat like a heart awakening from dreamless sleep. Far above this center point, in a realm of pure luminosity, where time moved like honey and thought became reality, the celestial sphere existed in perfect harmony. Here grew the great tree, whose roots reached into the very fabric of manifestation, its branches holding the glow of unborn stars, while its trunk pulsed with the rhythm that would one day become the heartbeat of all breathing things. Among the luminous inhabitants who dwelled beneath this tree lived a female whose very presence brought balance to the heavenly realm, though she carried within her womb the potential for all vitality that would ever flourish. The celestial mother's restlessness began as a whisper in her heart, growing stronger until it became a voice calling from the vast shadow below their realm. This voice spoke not in words, but in the language of longing itself, promising adventures beyond the safety of eternal perfection. When she finally approached the great tree and placed her hands upon its glowing bark, the ancient giant began to sing a melody that spoke of journeys into unknown realms, of sacrifices that enabled Genesis, of losses that made way for greater gains. The tree uprooted itself with a sound like the first wind ever to blow, carrying the Heavenly Mother with it as it disappeared through a hole that opened in the floor of the celestial sphere. Below, in the shadow that surrounded all manifestation, vast waters stretched without beginning or end, and in these waters swam creatures of unimaginable age and wisdom who had been waiting for countless eons for this moment of transformation. The great turtle positioned himself beneath the falling star of radiance that was the descending figure, knowing his shell would provide the foundation for whatever was to come. The water dwellers gathered around him, the muskrat whose courage exceeded his size, the beaver whose industry knew no bounds, the duck whose loyalty never wavered. When they understood that someone must dive to the bottom of reality itself to retrieve the primordial soil, the smallest among them volunteered for the task that would cost him everything. The muskrat's sacrifice echoed through the waters as he descended through crushing depths to grasp a handful of original dirt, giving his vitality so that manifestation might have a foundation. The soil that his tiny paws carried back to the surface spread across the turtle's shell, growing with each breath the descended mother took until it became vast enough to hold continents. Where her feet touched this new ground, vegetation sprang forth in an explosion of green growth that had never before existed. As the Heavenly Mother gave birth to her daughter upon this newly formed land, her radiance divided the primordial shadow for the first time since Genesis began. Day was born in that moment, and with it came the possibility of growth, metamorphosis, and the endless dance between illumination and darkness. The daughter who emerged was unlike her mother in every way, where the celestial parent carried the serene glow of the eternal realm. Her child pulsed with the restless energy of the material plane itself, becoming the ancestor through whom the gifts of both heaven and matter would flow to all future generations. This pattern of sacrifice and metamorphosis was already manifesting across the continent in forms as diverse as the peoples who would inherit them. Deep beneath the southwestern desert, the Hopi waited in their third realm, feeling the walls of their underground home cracking as the Sipapu, the portal through which they had originally entered, began to glow with the radiance of destiny. They had learned through their journey across 3 previous realms that growth required the courage to leave behind what was familiar, and now their time of emergence into the 4th plane was at hand. When their scouts climbed through the Sipapu into the blinding brightness above, they discovered a realm of infinite space where sky stretched farther than eyes could see, and land spread without boundaries. The air itself felt different here, thinner, more alive with possibility, charged with energies that made their hearts race. They emerged not as conquerors, but as students, carrying the corn that held within its kernels the concentrated wisdom of 3 realms, while remaining open to learning from the peoples they encountered. Their settlements spread across mesa tops, according to divine geography that aligned human activity with celestial movements and underground waters. Each clan carried specific responsibilities for maintaining cosmic harmony. The Bear Clan, holding knowledge of healing. The Snake Clan, maintaining relationships with waters above and below. The Eagle Clan, carrying messages between land and sky. Their understanding of emergence as an ongoing process of spiritual development would shape their ceremonies and governance for generations to come. Meanwhile, in the northern plains, where vast grasslands stretched toward distant horizons, an even more fundamental genesis was unfolding in the realm of absolute silence. Here, Inyan stirred in the primordial shadow, not a being in any sense that later peoples would understand, but the essence of solidity itself, the principle that would allow anything to have form, weight, substance. The desire to share the gift of manifestation with others burned within him, like fire contained within stone, growing until it became impossible to ignore. When Inyan opened his essence to release the generative force within him, the very nature of reality transformed. His blood, blue with the power of Genesis itself, flowed out to become Marka, the land, while his substance generated Scan, the heavens, whose breath became wind and whose voice became thunder. From the interaction of rock, soil, and atmosphere emerged we, the sun, who was not merely heat and brightness, but consciousness itself, the awakening awareness that would bloom in countless forms throughout manifestation. The relationship between these 4 divine powers established the fundamental pattern governing all future reality. Inyan's stability provided the foundation. Marka's fertility offered potential for growth. Scan's breath gave space for vitality to flourish, while wise consciousness awakened the sleeping possibilities within Genesis. Yet the Lakota understood that emergence was not a single event, but an ongoing process requiring constant renewal, constant participation by all creatures to keep the circle of existence turning. This understanding of Genesis as an active, ongoing relationship, rather than a completed event, found its most dramatic expression in the mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the trickster prepared for the greatest theft in the history of manifestation. In a realm covered by eternal shadow, where brightness itself was only a rumor, an old chief hoarded this precious gift in nested boxes at the far edge of reality, sharing it with no one, not even his own daughter. The clever bird's cunning plan required him to transform himself into a pine needle, drop into the chief's daughter's drinking water, and be reborn as her son. As a charming child, he gradually wore down his grandfather's resistance until the old man allowed him to play with the precious boxes. The moment the trickster held the innermost container, he resumed his true form and burst forth with the stolen brightness, scattering it across the darkened realm as he flew. The largest pieces became sun and moon, bringing the rhythm of day and night to a plane that had never known such cycles. Smaller pieces became stars scattered like seeds of illumination. But the clever one kept some radiance for himself, and this became fire, the gift that would allow human peoples to gather in the circle of warmth that forms community, brightness that required their participation to keep burning. The metamorphosis that illumination brought revealed both the beauty of manifestation and the challenges of consciousness. Suddenly, creatures could see each other clearly for the first time, but with visibility came comparison, judgment, and the seeds of conflict that would always accompany awareness. The gift of sight was also the burden of choice, the responsibility to use vision wisely rather than simply for advantage. Each of these emergence tales spoke to fundamental truths that transcended their specific origins. All recognized that Genesis required sacrifice, that new vitality could only emerge through the willingness of existing creatures to give up something of themselves for others. All understood that the realm was not a machine built once and forgotten, but a living system requiring constant renewal through the conscious participation of all inhabitants. The 4 directions that figured in these tales represented more than geography. They embodied different aspects of reality itself, the gifts and challenges each direction offered, the wisdom it contained, the reciprocity that characterized relationships between all creatures, established patterns that would govern human behavior for countless generations. Nothing was taken without giving something in return. Nothing received without acknowledging the source. Nothing used without considering the impact on 7 generations yet to come. Time itself operated differently in these emergence tales than in the linear narratives other peoples would construct. Events that happened in the beginning remained present and active in each moment. Genesis was not something that had happened once, but something always happening, something each generation participated in through their choices and actions. The emergence motif that appeared throughout these tales suggested that consciousness was an evolutionary process, that creatures grew in wisdom and responsibility as they moved through successive stages of development. The hopey journey through 4 realms, the progression from shadow to brightness in the Trickster's adventure, the heavenly mother's fall from the perfect celestial sphere to the challenging material plane, all spoke to the understanding that growth required movement, metamorphosis, sometimes loss of what was familiar and comfortable. These tales established not only the physical realm, but the moral universe that would guide human behavior. They taught that manifestation itself was a gift to be cherished and protected, warning against greed and selfishness, while promising that those who lived in right relationship with all things would find abundance. Most importantly, they established the understanding that would guide indigenous peoples throughout their history, that land was not property to be owned, but a relative to be respected, not a resource to be exploited, but a partner in the work of sustaining vitality. As the first peoples settled into the realm, prepared for them through such sacrifice and love, they carried the responsibility to remember these tales, to live according to their teachings, and to pass them on to future generations. The narratives were not entertainment, but instruction, not fantasy, but the most practical wisdom available for living in right relationship with all manifestation. The circle of existence had been established, connecting all creatures in relationships of mutual responsibility and reciprocal care. The realm that emerged was not a place of perfection, but a space of possibility, where conscious creatures could participate in the ongoing work of Genesis through their choices and actions. In this way, the first peoples took their place in the Great Circle, not as masters of the realm, but as conscious participants in its ongoing work, keepers of the narratives that would guide their descendants through whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The emergence tales had established the foundation of reality, but the work of shaping and sustaining this new domain required energies beyond anything the first peoples could provide alone. From the moment consciousness awakened in the material plane, vast divine influences began manifesting themselves in forms that human minds could comprehend and hearts could honor. These were not distant deities ruling from unreachable heights, but intimate partners in the ongoing dance of existence, entities whose very breath mingled with the wind and whose footsteps left tracks across the landscape of the soul. The great Thunderbird emerged from the storm clouds that gathered over the vast lakes and endless prairies, his wings spanning horizons as his eyes flashed with the fire of heaven itself. When he spread his mighty pinions, thunder rolled across the land like the voice of the Creator, speaking in tones too deep for ordinary hearing. Each beat of his wings sent lightning crackling throughout the atmosphere, illuminating the darkness that still clung to remote corners of the newly formed domain. The Thunderbird was no mere animal deity, but the embodiment of divine authority itself, the sky chief whose decisions determined whether crops would flourish or wither, whether rivers would flow or run dry. His eternal adversary writhed in the depths beneath the surface, coiled in underground rivers and hidden in the darkest caves that sunlight had never penetrated. The great horned serpent stretched his massive body across subterranean passages, his scales gleaming with the phosphorescent glow of deep waters as his horned head emerged periodically from springs and pools to taste the air of the upper domain. This was not evil opposing good, but the necessary tension between opposing energies that kept the cosmos in dynamic balance. The Thunderbird brought the masculine power of sky and storm, yet horned serpent offered the feminine wisdom of earth and water, the patient strength that wore away mountains and carved channels for rivers. Their eternal conflict played out across the landscape in ways both terrible and beautiful. When Thunderbird hurled his lightning spears at the serpent's hiding places, geysers erupted from the earth as underground streams changed their courses. When horned serpent lashed his tail in anger, earthquakes shook the foundations of mountains as new springs bubbled forth from previously dry ground. The peoples who witnessed such cosmic battles understood that they were observing the very mechanism by which their reality maintained its vitality, the dynamic tension that prevented existence from falling into either the chaos of uncontrolled change or the death of absolute stasis. Yet such great influences did not rule alone. From every direction came divine energies that claimed their own domains and offered their particular gifts to the human families, who learned to approach them with proper respect and understanding. In the sun-baked mesas of the southwest, red rock formations stretched toward azure skies like the fingers of sleeping giants. Spider Grandmother spun her web across the face of manifestation with patience that transcended all temporal limitations. Her tiny form belied the cosmic scope of her influence, for Spider Grandmother's web connected every living thing in patterns of mutual dependence and reciprocal responsibility. Each strand of her web vibrated with information about events occurring throughout the domain. The geometric patterns she wove, encoding the mathematical principles that governed everything, from the spiral of seashells to the rotation of celestial bodies. When human minds learned to read the signs she left in her webs, they discovered the secrets of astronomy, navigation, and the agricultural cycles that would sustain their people across countless generations. Spider grandmother's teaching methods differed radically from the dramatic sky influences. The Thunderbird announced his presence with earth-shaking proclamations, yet she whispered her wisdom via the barely perceptible vibrations of silk strands trembling in morning breezes. Her lessons came not from overwhelming revelation, but from patient observation of natural processes, from careful attention to details that less mindful observers might dismiss as insignificant. Those who learned to think like Spider Grandmother developed the intellectual virtues that would enable them to solve complex problems via persistent effort, rather than hoping for miraculous intervention. Beside her, in the southwestern landscape, danced Kokopelli, the humpbacked flute player whose music carried seeds of fertility across desert valleys that rainfall was scarce, and survival demanded both ingenuity and cooperation. His melodies awakened dormant energies in both human hearts and barren soil, his presence guaranteeing that vitality would find ways to flourish even in the harshest environments. Kokopelli's hunched back contained not deformity, but the concentrated essence of generative energy, his flute channeling cosmic influences via sound waves that penetrated matter itself. The ceremonies that honored Kokopelli recognized him as more than a simple fertility deity. His music represented the creative principle that transformed raw materials into forms of beauty and utility, the artistic inspiration that enabled human consciousness to participate actively in the ongoing work of shaping reality. When craftsmen carved his image into cliff faces, or potters painted his likeness on ceremonial vessels, they were invoking not just biological fertility, but the creative fertility that produced poetry, architecture, agriculture, and all the cultural achievements that distinguished human societies from simple survival. Along the storm-lashed coasts of the Pacific Northwest, ancient forests grew so dense that sunlight reached the ground in scattered beams, like pillars supporting a green cathedral. The raven's influence extended far beyond his role as lightbringer. Having scattered illumination across the darkened domain, he had become the master of transformation itself, the entity whose very presence guaranteed that nothing would remain static long enough to become stagnant or sterile. Raven's black feathers absorbed all colors, yet reflected none, making him the perfect mediator between the domain of visible manifestation and the invisible energies that drove all change. His companion influences along the western shores included Whale, whose massive body contained oceans of wisdom accumulated during migrations that spanned the globe's circumference. When Whale sang his deep songs, the vibrations traveled via water and earth to reach the ears of those who needed guidance for their own journeys, across the sometimes treacherous currents of existence. His breaching was a reminder that even the largest and most powerful entities needed to surface periodically to breathe the air of higher domains, his diving demonstrating the courage required to explore the mysterious depths that the most valuable treasures lay hidden. The transformer entities who shaped the Pacific landscape worked via methods that combined physical and metaphysical engineering. Such influences possessed the ability to alter geography via pure intention, turning mountains into islands, redirecting river courses and creating the salmon runs that would sustain coastal peoples for thousands of years. Yet their transformations always served larger purposes than mere convenience or aesthetic preference. Each geographical change encoded moral lessons about the consequences of different ways of living, creating a landscape that functioned as both physical habitat and metaphysical curriculum. From the northern plains, vast grass seas stretched beyond horizons, and buffalo herds moved like dark clouds across the face of the earth, came white buffalo calf women carrying gifts that would sustain the Lakota nation via trials that tested their commitment to living in harmony with all relations. Her arrival among the people marked not just the introduction of new ceremonial practices, but a fundamental transformation in their understanding of what it meant to be human in a cosmos populated by conscious divine influences. The sacred pipe she brought was no mere ritual object, but a communication device that enabled direct contact with the energies that governed weather, hunting success, community harmony, and individual development. When properly used, the pipe created a temporary portal between the material plane and the domain of deities, allowing prayers to reach their intended recipients, bringing guidance and blessings back to those who offered their tobacco with sincere hearts and clear intentions. White Buffalo Calf Woman's teachings extended far beyond ceremonial instruction to encompass a complete philosophy of reciprocal relationship with all forms of consciousness. She explained that human minds occupied a unique position in the cosmic hierarchy, possessing both the ability to communicate with divine influences and the responsibility to use that communication for the benefit of all vitality, rather than merely for personal advantage. Her prophecies spoke of times when this understanding would be tested by peoples who viewed the natural domain as a collection of resources to be exploited, rather than as a community of relatives to be honored. The buffalo herself became a manifestation of such principles, providing not just meat, hides, and bone tools, but embodying the willing sacrifice that enabled existence to sustain itself via the consumption of other existence. When hunters approached buffalo herds with proper ceremonial preparation, they were not taking vitality, but participating in a cosmic exchange in which the buffalo nation offered their bodies so that human societies could survive, human ceremonies ensuring that the essence of the buffalo would be honored and their physical forms restored in the great cycle of death and rebirth. This understanding of animal nations as conscious entities with their own governance, customs, and metaphysical practices extended throughout the continent, creating a political landscape far more complex than later observers would recognize. The Eagle Nation ruled the high places, their keen vision enabling them to serve as messengers between earthbound peoples and the sky influences who directed weather patterns and seasonal changes. Eagle feathers became symbols of achievement, not because of their beauty, but because they represented successful communication with entities whose perspective encompassed vast territories and extended time periods. The Wolf Nation provided teachings about pack loyalty, coordinated hunting strategies, and the social organization necessary for survival in environments that individual effort alone would prove inadequate. Their howling created communication networks that spanned hundreds of miles, enabling the coordination of activities across territories too large for any human system to manage effectively. When human leaders sought to learn the arts of governance, they studied wolfpack behavior to understand how authority could be exercised without destroying the cooperation it was meant to facilitate. The Bear Nation held knowledge of healing plants, hibernation cycles, and the connection between physical health and metaphysical balance. Their periodic withdrawal from active existence demonstrated the necessity of rest, reflection, and renewal. Their fierce protection of cubs providing models for defending societies against external threats. Bear medicine taught that true strength came not from constant aggression, but from the ability to be peaceful when peace served existence, and ferocious when ferocity was needed to protect what could not protect itself. Such animal nations maintained their own territories, seasonal migrations, and diplomatic ties with human societies via treaty arrangements that demanded constant renewal and careful attention to changing circumstances. The protocols governing such connections were as complex as any international diplomacy, involving gift exchanges, ceremonial observances, and mutual obligations that bound both parties to behaviors that sustained the web of existence for all participants. Among the most powerful of such divine influences were the weather entities, whose decisions determined whether human societies would flourish or struggle. The wind deities carried messages between distant places, bringing the rains that enabled agriculture and filled the streams that provided water for drinking and transportation. Their moods shifted with seasonal patterns, but could also be influenced by ceremonial approaches that demonstrated proper respect for their power and understanding of their role in maintaining cosmic balance. The rain entities danced in cloudscapes that stretched across vast territories, their movements creating the patterns of precipitation that determined which types of vegetation could grow and how human settlements should be positioned to take advantage of favorable conditions. Their generosity provided the moisture that enabled existence to flourish, but their anger could bring floods that washed away entire societies, or droughts that turned fertile valleys into dusty wastelands. The direction deities held court at the cardinal points, each offering particular gifts demanding specific types of respect and acknowledgement. East brought the energy of new beginnings, the daily renewal that made growth and healing possible. South provided the warmth of maturation, the patient heat that enabled seeds to germinate and children to develop into capable adults. West offered the wisdom of completion, the understanding that came only via experiencing the full cycle of growth, maturity, and gentle release. North held the power of purification, the cleansing cold that eliminated weakness, strengthening whatever proved durable enough to endure testing. At the center of this directional mandala stood the human person, positioned to receive gifts from all directions, bearing responsibility for maintaining the balance that kept the entire system functioning harmoniously. This was not a position of dominance, but one of service, demanding constant attention to the needs of all relations, and the wisdom to know when intervention was helpful, and when it would disrupt natural processes that needed to unfold without interference. The seasonal ceremonies that developed to honor such connections created annual cycles that aligned human activities with natural rhythms, providing regular opportunities for societies to renew their commitments to living in harmony with divine influences. Spring ceremonies welcomed the returning warmth and celebrated the emergence of new vitality from winter's apparent death. Summer festivals honored the abundance that came via cooperation between human effort and natural generosity. Autumn rituals expressed gratitude for harvests preparing for the introspective period that would come with winter's darkness. Winter ceremonies sustained societies during the challenging months, maintaining metaphysical connections that would enable renewal when spring returned. Such ceremonial cycles were not mere seasonal observances, but sophisticated systems for maintaining psychological, social, and metaphysical health in societies that depended entirely on their ability to read natural signs and respond appropriately to changing conditions. The ceremonies created shared experiences that bound societies together, providing frameworks for individual development that served collective as well as personal needs. The plant nations offered their own forms of partnership, with corn, beans, and squash forming the foundation alliance that would sustain agricultural peoples throughout the continent. Such three sisters taught complementary growing techniques that maximize soil fertility, providing nutritionally complete diets. But their gifts extended far beyond agricultural utility to encompass metaphysical teachings about cooperation, mutual support, and the patience needed for long-term sustainability. Corn became the sacred plant, whose life cycle encoded the fundamental principles of development. Like human consciousness, corn demanded careful tending via various stages of growth, protection from threats that could destroy the young plants, and harvesting techniques that preserved seeds for future plantings. The grinding of corn into meal provided opportunities for contemplative work that calmed the mind, nourishing the body. The storage of surplus grain, teaching lessons about planning for future needs without hoarding resources that could benefit others. The medicine plants offered more specialized partnerships with individuals who demonstrated the dedication needed to learn their particular properties and appropriate uses. Tobacco became the universal offering plant, its smoke carrying prayers to divine domains, creating the reciprocal exchange that maintained healthy connections between human and non-human consciousness. Sage provided purification, its sharp scent clearing negative influences, opening the mind to receive guidance from helpful deities. Sweetgrass brought peace and harmony, its gentle fragrance creating atmospheres conducive to healing and reconciliation. Each plant medicine demanded specific approaches that honored the plant's own nature, accessing its healing properties. Some plants required fasting and purification before they would share their gifts. Others worked only when gathered at particular times or in specific ways that demonstrated the gatherer's understanding of the connection between human need and plant generosity. The knowledge of such ties was passed down via apprenticeships that lasted years or decades, creating lineages of plant knowledge that preserved both practical information and the metaphysical understanding necessary for effective healing. The underground domain held its own divine influences, with cave systems serving as portals to the territory of earth deities, who controlled mineral deposits, underground waters, and the deep stability that anchored surface manifestations. Such deities rarely interacted directly with surface dwellers, but their influence could be felt via changes in spring flows, the availability of high-quality stone for tools and construction, and the mysterious energies that determined locations valuable resources could be found. The emergence of Kachina traditions in the southwest created systematic approaches to maintaining connections with the diverse divine influences that affected daily existence. Such elaborate ceremonial cycles brought deity entities into temporary physical manifestation via masked dancers who embodied specific energies for the duration of particular ceremonies. The Kachinas were not mere representations of divine influences, but actual vehicles such influences could work in the material domain to bring rain, heal sickness, resolve conflicts, and maintain the cosmic harmony that enabled societies to flourish. Each Kachina possessed specific characteristics, requirements, and areas of influence that had to be respected and understood by those who sought to work with their power. Some Kachinas brought healing energy, others focused on agricultural fertility. Still others specialized in teaching proper behavior to children or resolving disputes between community members. The complexity of such connections demanded extensive training for those who would serve as Kachina dancers, since improper performance could disrupt divine ties with consequences that affected entire societies. The vision quest traditions that developed throughout much of the continent provided individual pathways for establishing personal connections with divine influences, contributing to community welfare via the wisdom and abilities gained from such encounters. Young people seeking their adult names and metaphysical purposes would withdraw to isolated places. They could fast, pray, and remain open to whatever divine guidance might emerge from their sincere seeking. Such vision quests were not casual adventures, but carefully structured rites of passage that tested the seeker's commitment, providing frameworks for interpreting whatever experiences might occur. The preparation demanded purification ceremonies, instruction from elders, and the development of mental and physical disciplines that would enable the seeker to endure the challenges of extended isolation without food or water. The guardian deities encountered during successful vision quests became lifelong partners who provided guidance, protection, and special abilities that served both individual development and community needs. A person might receive animal entities that provided hunting skills, plant deities that offered healing knowledge, or celestial influences that brought prophetic abilities or leadership qualities. Such divine partnerships created the foundation for specialized roles within societies, ensuring that individual achievements served collective welfare rather than merely personal advancement. The metaphysical landscape that emerged from countless connections between human societies and non-human consciousness created a reality far richer and more complex than later observers would recognize. Every feature of the natural environment, from the smallest stone to the mightiest mountain, possessed its own form of consciousness and its own role in the cosmic web of ties that sustained all existence. This understanding demanded human minds to approach their daily activities with constant awareness of their impact on the divine as well as physical environment. Hunting demanded ceremonies to honor the animal deities and ensure that their sacrifice contributed to the welfare of all existence, rather than merely satisfying human appetite. Agriculture required ongoing communication with plant deities, soil entities, and weather influences to maintain the cooperative connections that enabled successful harvests. Even simple activities like gathering firewood or drinking from streams demanded acknowledgement of the divine entities whose generosity made human survival possible. The result was a civilization that understood itself as one voice in a vast cosmic chorus, contributing its own unique harmonies, listening carefully to the melodies sung by all other forms of consciousness. This was not primitive animism, but a sophisticated understanding of reality that recognized consciousness as the fundamental principle underlying all material manifestation, demanding human minds to live as conscious participants in a universe populated by aware and responsive divine influences whose cooperation was essential for the continuation of existence itself. From the moment the first peoples settled into their newly formed reality, they discovered that the cosmos operated according to principles far more complex and paradoxical than simple harmony or straightforward divine order. The universe revealed itself as a place of creative tension, magnificent contradictions, and sacred chaos that required a special class of teachers to navigate successfully. These instructors came not as solemn prophets or wise elders, but as figures whose very nature embodied the essential paradox of existence itself, beings who taught through disruption, who revealed truth through apparent folly, who created order through calculated disorder. The shapeshifter emerged as the most essential character in this cosmic drama, serving simultaneously as fool and philosopher, destroyer and creator, the sacred clown whose antics concealed the deepest insights. Unlike the majestic sky powers or the nurturing earth mothers, these transformative figures possess no fixed nature, no permanent form, no predictable agenda. They existed in the spaces between categories, the cracks in conventional thinking, the moments when reality revealed its fundamental fluidity. To encounter such a being was to confront the disturbing truth that existence itself was far stranger, more dangerous, and more wonderful than most minds dared to imagine. The clever canine stepped into this role with particular enthusiasm across the vast territories of the West, his lanky form becoming synonymous with the kind of learning that could only come through experience, usually painful experience gained at considerable cost to dignity and preconceptions. He was not the noble wolf of pack loyalty or the wise bear of healing knowledge, but something far more ambiguous. A canine whose intelligence was matched only by his capacity for spectacular miscalculation, whose success was inevitably followed by equally spectacular failure. The nations of the high desert and mountain valleys learned to read his adventures as a curriculum in the fundamental principles of survival, though the lessons came disguised as entertainment, and the insights emerged only through careful reflection on the patterns underlying his seemingly random mishaps. When the clever one convinced himself that he could fly like the eagles, his inevitable crash landing taught the importance of recognizing one's own limitations. When he tried to hoard water during a drought, his elaborate schemes always backfired in ways that demonstrated the futility of opposing natural cycles. When he attempted to seduce his way out of difficult situations, his romantic failures illustrated the dangers of substituting charm for genuine virtue. Yet his greatest teachings emerged from his role as the transformer of landscapes and the inadvertent creator of the geographical features that would define the territories his people inhabited. His wanderings across the vast western landscapes left behind a trail of geological formations, each one encoding a moral lesson about the consequences of particular types of behavior. The great canyon he created while trying to dig a shortcut to the ocean became a permanent reminder that true achievement required patience and respect for natural processes. The scattered boulders he left behind during a tantrum over a failed fishing expedition demonstrated how anger could turn useful resources into obstacles. In the Columbia River Territory, the canine's encounter with the salmon hoarding chief at Celilo Falls revealed his capacity for combining selfish motivation with accidentally beneficial outcomes. The chief had built a massive trap that captured all the salmon running upriver, leaving the nations who lived upstream facing starvation while he grew fat on his monopolized bounty. The shapeshifter's initial interest in the situation stemmed purely from his own hunger, but his characteristic inability to execute simple plans led to a comedy of errors that ultimately freed the salmon for everyone. His first attempt to steal salmon involved disguising himself as a visiting dignitary, but his performance was so transparently false that even the chief's children saw through it. His second plan required transforming himself into a baby that the chief's wife would adopt, but his adult appetites proved impossible to conceal in infant form. His third scheme involved seducing the chief's daughter, but his bragging about previous conquests undermined his romantic credibility. Each failure taught the watching nations something valuable about patience, humility, and the importance of considering others' needs rather than focusing exclusively on personal desires. The final resolution came not through clever planning, but through his characteristic impetuosity. Frustrated by his repeated failures, he simply charged at the salmon trap in broad daylight, howling threats and insults. The absurdity of this approach so startled the chief and his guards that they hesitated long enough for the canine to reach the dam and begin tearing it apart with his teeth and claws. By the time they recovered from their surprise, the salmon were already swimming free, spreading upriver to feed communities that had been hungry for far too long. This tale became foundational for comprehending how individual actions, even those motivated by selfish concerns, could serve larger purposes when they aligned with natural justice. The clever one had not intended to become a liberator, but his refusal to accept the chief's monopoly had accidentally served the common good. The narrative taught that sometimes the most effective resistance to injustice came not from careful planning, but from simple refusal to tolerate intolerable situations, even when such refusal appeared foolish to more cautious observers. The regional variations of his adventures revealed how different nations adapted his essential character to address their own particular challenges and geographical realities. In the Mojave Desert, his water-finding expeditions taught crucial survival skills disguised as slapstick comedy. His repeated failures to locate water using magical shortcuts forced him to learn and inadvertently demonstrate the practical techniques of reading landscape signs, following animal tracks to water sources, and conserving precious moisture during long journeys across barren terrain. The desert nations particularly treasured the cycle of tales in which the canine convinced himself that he had discovered the secret of creating water through willpower alone. His elaborate rituals and increasingly desperate ceremonies provided detailed negative examples of approaches that didn't work, while his eventual success through simple observation and practical effort demonstrated the methods that did. Children who memorized these accounts absorbed crucial desert survival knowledge, while being entertained by his magnificent failures and eventual humble victories. In the northern forests, his hunting adventures taught the complex skills required for successful pursuit of game in dense woodland environments. His early attempts relied on brute force and simple cunning, approaches that worked occasionally, but more often resulted in empty-handed returns and wounded pride. The forest nations developed extensive cycles of hunting tales that systematically covered every aspect of woodland hunting, reading tracks, interpreting wind patterns, moving silently through thick underbrush, and most importantly, maintaining the patience required for successful stalking. One particularly instructive cycle followed his obsession with hunting the great elk, whose antlers supposedly held magical properties that would make their possessor irresistible to potential mates. His pursuit of this elk took him through every type of forest terrain and every season of the year, forcing him to learn adaptation techniques that the listening communities could apply to their own hunting challenges. His failures taught what not to do, while his rare successes demonstrated proper methods, and his ultimate realization that the elk's magical powers were less important than the skills gained during the hunt provided the moral framework that transformed practical instruction into insight. The Great Basin nations developed their own traditions around his role as an inadvertent creator of useful plants and geographical features. Their accounts followed his attempts to remake the world according to his own convenience, efforts that invariably produced results he had not intended, but that proved beneficial for the human families who would later inhabit those territories. When he tried to create a tree that would drop ripe fruit directly into his mouth, his botanical experiments produced the pinyon pine, whose nuts would sustain communities through countless difficult winters. When he attempted to dig a private bathing pool, his excavations created the natural springs that would serve as reliable water sources for generations. These transformation accounts served multiple educational purposes simultaneously. They provided geographical orientation by explaining how familiar landscape features had originated, practical instruction about which plants were useful and how to harvest them sustainably, and moral guidance about the relationship between intention and outcome. Children who learn these narratives develop both practical knowledge about their environment and philosophical comprehension about the unpredictable nature of cause and effect. The consequences of ignoring his lessons formed another crucial element in shapeshifter education. Communities that dismissed his adventures as mere entertainment, who failed to extract the practical insights embedded in his failures, often found themselves repeating his mistakes in situations where the costs were much higher than wounded pride or temporary hunger. The accounts preserved memories of individuals and even entire settlements that had suffered serious consequences because they had not learned the lessons that his adventures were designed to teach. One particularly sobering cycle of tales described a village that had grown prosperous through trading, but had become arrogant about their success. when the canine visited their territory and began his characteristic series of foolish schemes. The villagers dismissed him as a harmless fool, whose antics provided amusing entertainment but offered no practical instruction. They failed to notice that his bungled attempts at food storage perfectly illustrated the mistakes they were making in their own resource management, or that his romantic failures demonstrated the same pride and dishonesty that was corrupting their trading relationships. The village's eventual collapse came not through dramatic catastrophe, but through the accumulation of small errors that his narratives had warned against. Their food storage techniques, based on pride rather than practical knowledge, left them vulnerable to spoilage and pest damage. Their trading relationships, maintained through increasingly elaborate deceptions rather than honest dealing, eventually collapsed when their reputation for dishonesty spread to other settlements. Their leadership, chosen for charisma rather than insight, proved incapable of responding effectively to challenges that required patience and humility rather than grand gestures. The survivors of this collapse, scattered among other settlements, carried with them a hard-won appreciation of why shapeshifter accounts required serious attention despite their apparently frivolous surface. They became some of the most effective teachers of this ancient knowledge, able to explain from personal experience why these lessons demanded careful study rather than casual amusement. Across the northern territories, where ice and forest created different challenges, Nanaboojo emerged as the transformer, whose adventures shaped both landscape and culture in ways that would influence generations of Anishinaabe nations. Unlike the canine's primarily individual focus, Nanaboojo's accounts centered on his role as cultural creator, the being whose schemes and mishaps established the foundations for human society in the challenging environments of the Great Lakes region. Nanaboojo's landscape-shaping adventures began with his attempt to create a shortcut across what would become Lake Superior. His plan involved convincing the lake entities to freeze the water permanently, creating a solid roadway that would eliminate the need for dangerous canoe voyages during storms. His negotiations with the water entities revealed his characteristic combination of good intentions and poor planning. He offered them increasingly elaborate gifts and promises, without comprehending that they were not interested in fundamentally altering the natural order to accommodate his convenience. When diplomatic approaches failed, Nanaboojo resorted to trickery, attempting to steal the entity's ice-making powers while they slept. His theft was successful enough to freeze large portions of the lake, but his incomplete grasp of the magic meant that the ice formed in unpredictable patterns, creating the maze of islands, peninsulas, and hidden channels that would characterize the region's geography. The lake entities, awakening to find their domain partially frozen in chaotic patterns, responded by creating the fierce storms that would make winter travel even more dangerous than before. Nanaboojo's attempt to correct his mistake only made the situation worse. His efforts to negotiate a compromise with the angry entities led to the establishment of the seasonal freeze-thaw cycle that would define the region's climate. But his insistence on maintaining some permanent ice formations resulted in the unpredictable spring breakups that would challenge future generations of travelers. The moral embedded in this geographical creation account was clear. Attempting to circumvent natural processes for personal convenience often created greater challenges than the original difficulties. The cultural innovations that emerged from Nanaboojo's adventures provided equally instructive examples of how transformative change could arise from apparently misguided enterprises. His attempts to improve upon traditional hunting methods led to the development of new tools and techniques that proved genuinely useful, though rarely in the ways he had originally intended. His efforts to create magical fishing equipment resulted in the invention of more effective nets and traps, after his supernatural approaches failed spectacularly. His schemes for easier food preparation led to the discovery of new cooking methods and food preservation techniques that emerged from his attempts to repair the damage caused by his failed magical experiments. One of Nanaboojo's most significant cultural contributions came through his disastrous attempt to establish himself as a great chief without grasping the responsibilities that leadership required. His campaign for recognition began with increasingly elaborate displays of his supposed powers, demonstrations that impressed some observers while alienating others who recognized the superficiality of his achievements. His attempts to solidify his authority through grand gestures and magical solutions to community problems created more difficulties than they solved, forcing him to develop genuine leadership skills through trial and error. The process of learning actual leadership transformed Nanaboojo from a self-aggrandizing shapeshifter into a more complex figure who embodied both the dangers of power-seeking and the genuine qualities that effective leaders needed to cultivate. His eventual recognition that true authority came through service rather than domination, that effective solutions required analyzing problems rather than imposing magical fixes, and that sustainable settlements needed cooperative effort rather than individual brilliance, provided foundational principles for Anishinaabe governance that would guide political development for centuries. The teaching functions that these accounts served extended beyond individual instruction to encompass social boundary maintenance and cultural preservation. Settlements used such tales to address sensitive topics that direct confrontation might make worse, to critique behaviors that threatened group harmony without directly attacking the individuals involved, and to maintain cultural values while adapting to changing circumstances. The shapeshifter's role as sacred clown provided a socially acceptable way to discuss forbidden topics, challenge authority when necessary, and preserve crucial knowledge that might otherwise be lost during difficult periods. The gender-specific traditions that existed in many cultures revealed the sophisticated comprehension these societies had developed about the different types of insight that various perspectives could provide. Female shapeshifter figures, like Kokopelli's female counterpart in some southwestern traditions, or the old woman transformer of certain northern accounts, offered teachings that complemented the predominantly male transformer knowledge without simply duplicating it. These female figures often focused on domestic insight, social relationship skills, and the types of knowledge that sustained settlements through long-term challenges rather than immediate crises. The seasonal aspects of shapeshifter storytelling created annual cycles of instruction that aligned character development with natural rhythms, while ensuring that crucial survival knowledge was reviewed regularly. Winter accounts focused on the planning and resource management skills needed to survive the challenging months when outdoor activity was limited. Spring tales emphasized renewal, adaptation, and the courage needed to try new approaches after winter's contemplative period. Summer narratives taught the active skills of hunting, gathering, and community building, while autumn accounts focused on preparation, gratitude, and the insight needed to evaluate the year's experiences. The boundary enforcement functions that these tales served helped settlements maintain social cohesion while accommodating individual differences and changing circumstances. When community members violated important social norms, shapeshifter accounts provided indirect ways to address the problems without creating the confrontations that direct criticism might provoke. The narratives allowed people to recognize their own behavioral patterns in the transformers' mistakes, while preserving the social relationships that direct confrontation might damage. The psychological insight embedded in these traditions recognized that human nature included both creative and destructive impulses, both intelligence and foolishness, both generous and selfish motivations. Rather than demanding impossible perfection, the accounts taught people how to work with their actual psychological realities, how to channel problematic impulses in less harmful directions, and how to learn from mistakes rather than being paralyzed by them. The shapeshifters example showed that failure was not only survivable, but potentially educational, that dignity could be recovered from even spectacular humiliation, and that knowledge often emerged from experiences that initially seemed purely negative. The cross-cultural transmission of these accounts created networks of shared comprehension that transcended tribal boundaries while preserving local variations that addressed specific environmental and cultural challenges. Trade routes carried transformer tales along with material goods, but the narratives adapted to local conditions in ways that maintained their essential character while incorporating new elements relevant to different audiences. This adaptability demonstrated the fundamental vitality of shapeshifter knowledge, its capacity to remain relevant across changing circumstances while preserving core insights about human nature and the fundamental principles governing existence. The ultimate teaching that emerged from all transformer traditions was the recognition that reality itself possessed shapeshifter-like qualities. It was unpredictable, often paradoxical, frequently ironic, and always more complex than it initially appeared. Learning to live successfully in such a reality required developing transformer-like qualities: flexibility, humor, resilience, and the capacity to find opportunity in apparent disaster. The shapeshifter's greatest gift was not any particular lesson, but the development of the psychological and spiritual flexibility needed to keep learning throughout life, to remain open to new possibilities even after experiencing repeated disappointments, and to maintain hope even when circumstances seemed hopeless. In this way, the transformer served as both teacher and exemplar, providing specific practical instruction while modeling the general approach to existence that would enable people to navigate successfully whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The world the shapeshifter had helped to create was not a safe or predictable place, but it was a place where conscious beings could learn, grow, adapt, and ultimately flourish, if they developed the insight to appreciate both the dangers and the gifts that creative chaos provided. Chaos had served its purpose in reshaping the world through trickster intervention, but creation now demanded a different kind of teacher, champions who could demonstrate what mortal beings might accomplish when they aligned their individual will with divine purpose, when they chose service over comfort, when they accepted that true authority came through harmony with forces far greater than themselves. Unlike the tricksters who taught through failure and comic mishap, these emerging figures embodied the possibility that conscious beings could rise to meet cosmic challenges through courage, wisdom, and willingness to sacrifice personal desires for the welfare of all creation. Yet these were not the invincible champions of later traditions, armored in certainty and protected by divine favoritism. Heroes who emerged from indigenous understanding possessed a complexity that reflected the actual challenges of existence. Their greatest victories often came at tremendous personal cost. Their insight was earned through suffering, and their power stemmed not from dominating others, but from learning to work in harmony with cosmic forces. They served as teachers whose lessons came through example rather than precept, guides whose travels revealed pathways that others might follow when they faced their own moments of testing. From the high mesas of the southwest, where red sandstone formations caught morning light, like ancient altars blazing with sacred fire, emerged twin brothers whose names would echo across generations as embodiments of balanced power properly applied. Monster Slayer and Born for Water appeared during a time when the newly created realm writhed under the dominance of creatures whose size and ferocity made normal existence impossible for Earth surface peoples. These were not mere animals grown large through some cosmic accident, but manifestations of chaotic forces that threatened to overwhelm the delicate balance necessary for conscious existence to flourish. Their birth itself represented a new phase in cosmic evolution, for they were children of the Sun, Father, and changing woman, inheriting both celestial energy and terrestrial wisdom in combinations that had never before existed in material form. Monster Slayer emerged from the womb, carrying the focused energy of solar fire, embodying the masculine principle of direct action and decisive intervention that could cut through problems like lightning splitting stone. Born for Water brought complementary gifts of flowing adaptation and patient persistence, the feminine understanding that could wear away mountains through gentle but relentless pressure applied over vast periods of time. Childhood among Earth's surface people revealed tensions inherent in beings who carried divine energy within mortal forms. Their supernatural strength manifested unpredictably, sometimes helping their foster family with impossible tasks, other times creating problems that required careful management to avoid community disruption. Learning to control and properly direct such gifts required education that went far beyond ordinary childhood instruction. They had to master not just how to use their abilities, but when to use them, how to distinguish between situations calling for intervention and those demanding restraint, how to serve larger purposes without losing their individual identity in the process. Discovery of their true parentage launched the expedition that would define their adult roles and establish patterns for all future heroic development. Seeking out their father in his solar palace required traversing landscapes where ordinary beings could not survive, passing tests that examined every aspect of their developing character, while proving their worthiness to inherit cosmic responsibilities. They had to demonstrate not only physical courage, but mental flexibility, emotional resilience, and spiritual maturity, sophisticated enough to earn divine recognition and support from powers that governed fundamental forces. Tests administered by the Sun, Father, revealed the complex nature of heroic development, examining qualities that seemed contradictory. The ability to be both humble and confident, both compassionate and ruthless, both individually distinctive and harmoniously unified. They had to prove they could work together without losing their distinct identities, that they could wield authority without being corrupted by it, and that they could accept responsibility for consequences affecting generations of beings they would never meet. Only by passing such examinations could they receive the weapons and knowledge necessary for their monster-slaying campaign. Their systematic approach to eliminating the creatures terrorizing Earth-surface peoples demonstrated how heroic action required intelligence as well as courage, careful planning as well as bold execution. Rather than charging recklessly into battle, the brothers studied each monster's habits, territories, and vulnerabilities before engaging in combat, understanding that occasional lucky victories could not provide the comprehensive safety their people needed. Their methodology combined spiritual preparation with tactical innovation, incorporating patience that could sustain long campaigns against seemingly impossible odds. When they finally confronted Chinahale, the great bird monster whose talons could crush boulders and whose wings created windstorms that toppled trees, their complementary fighting styles revealed how different approaches could work together to overcome challenges that would defeat either brother fighting alone. Monster Slayer's direct assault drew the creature's attention and forced it into positions where Born for Water's more subtle attacks could exploit vulnerabilities that pure aggression could never reach. Victory came not through overwhelming force, but through coordinated effort that maximized each brother's strengths while compensating for limitations. Similar tactical sophistication characterized their battle against Tealget, the water monster whose defeat would eliminate a terrible threat to travelers, while potentially disrupting water systems sustaining entire ecosystems. They had to devise methods for destroying the creature that would minimize environmental damage while ensuring its destructive influence was permanently eliminated. Their solution required engineering skills as sophisticated as their combat abilities, redirecting water flows to trap the monster in positions where it could be destroyed without causing catastrophic flooding that might harm innocent communities. Each victory revealed new lessons about the relationship between power and responsibility, teaching them that their greatest challenges came not from the monsters they fought, but from temptations to use their abilities for personal advantage, or to solve problems that required other people's own efforts for proper resolution. They learned that heroic power was most effective when used sparingly, in situations where ordinary means were genuinely inadequate, and always in service of principles larger than individual preference or tribal advantage. Transformation of defeated monsters into beneficial landscape features encoded lasting lessons about the relationship between destruction and creation, demonstrating that true heroic action sought not merely to eliminate threats, but to redirect destructive forces toward constructive purposes. Rather than simply destroying their enemies, the brothers transformed their essence into formations that would serve beneficial purposes for future generations. The bird monster's body becoming rock formations, providing shelter and landmarks for travelers. The water monster's bones becoming mineral deposits, supplying tools and building materials for human communities. Such transformative approaches revealed their understanding that even destructive forces contained valuable elements that could be preserved and redirected toward beneficial ends. Their legacy lay not only in the safety they had created, but in the enhanced capabilities they had provided for those who would follow, demonstrating that heroic responsibility extended beyond immediate problem-solving to include long-term enhancement of conditions, enabling future generations to flourish. Educational functions served by the twin heroes' adventures extended far beyond entertainment to encompass systematic instruction in skills and attitudes required for effective leadership under challenging circumstances. Young people who memorized these accounts absorbed detailed lessons about strategic thinking, tactical planning, psychological preparation for high-stakes challenges, and emotional resilience required for sustained effort in the face of repeated difficulties and setbacks. Yet the accounts also provided frameworks for understanding how individual development connected to community welfare, how personal achievement could serve collective needs without sacrificing authentic individual expression, and how power could be wielded in ways that strengthened rather than corrupted both the wielder and the society granting such authority. Their example demonstrated that true leadership required not just ability to overcome external challenges, but wisdom to overcome internal challenges that power and recognition inevitably created in those who achieved significant accomplishments. Far to the north, where ice and ocean created conditions challenging every aspect of human survival, a different pattern of heroic development emerged through the tragic transformation of a young woman whose betrayal by those she trusted most catalyzed her metamorphosis into a goddess whose power would sustain Arctic peoples for countless generations. Her story began not with supernatural birth or divine calling, but with ordinary human emotions, love, trust, disappointment, rage, and despair, that escalated into cosmic consequences affecting all existence in northern regions. Her father's decision to give her in marriage to a stranger whose true nature remained hidden beneath appealing disguises set in motion events that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the Arctic. Only after marriage ceremonies were completed did she discover herself trapped in relationship with a creature whose demands and behaviors violated every principle of proper human conduct, demonstrating how individual choices involving trust and commitment could lead to consequences far beyond anything initially anticipated by those making such decisions. Crisis came when her father attempted rescue from her monstrous husband, their escape by kayak seeming successful, until the creature discovered their flight and summoned supernatural storms threatening to destroy them both. Faced with choosing between his own survival and his daughter's safety, the father made the decision that would echo through Arctic traditions for countless generations. He pushed her overboard, believing that sacrificing her would appease the storms and allow him to reach safety, not understanding that his betrayal would awaken powers within her that would transform the entire relationship between human and marine existence. Struggling in icy waters, her father's betrayal created anger so profound it reached the deepest levels of her being and awakened abilities she had never suspected she possessed. Fury at human betrayal, combined with desperate need for survival in the killing cold to trigger metamorphosis that would make her sovereign of all existence in ocean depths. Her fingers, frozen and broken by attempts to cling to her father's kayak, became the seals, whales, walruses, and fish that would sustain Arctic peoples for all future generations, while her rage became the force determining whether hunting would succeed or fail. Moral complexity of her transformation provided instruction in relationships between justice and survival, individual rights and collective needs, personal grievance and cosmic responsibility. Her anger at human betrayal was entirely justified, yet her authority over sea creatures meant that her emotional state directly affected survival of the same peoples whose representatives had wronged her. Arctic hunters seeking her creatures had to understand that success required not just skill and courage, but acknowledgement of injustice that had created their dependency on her reluctant generosity. Shamanic expeditions, undertaken to appease her when anger made hunting unsuccessful, revealed sophisticated psychological and spiritual preparation required for heroic intervention in cosmic affairs. Shamans who descended to her underwater realm had to possess not only supernatural traveling abilities, but diplomatic skills necessary for negotiating with a goddess whose grievances were legitimate and whose power was absolute within her domain. Such journeys required passing through multiple layers of reality, each presenting challenges, testing different aspects of preparation and commitment. Underwater negotiations demanded that shamans confront their own capacity for the kind of betrayal that had created her anger, while accepting responsibility for their people's continued dependence on her resources. Success required demonstrating understanding of injustice, while offering genuine commitment to behavioral changes that would prevent repetition of such violations. Only through such authentic acknowledgement could shamans hope to secure her cooperation in providing the marine resources their communities needed for survival. Across the continent, in eastern woodlands, where ancient forests created cathedral spaces beneath towering canopies, and clear streams carried their songs toward distant seas, Wabanaki peoples preserved adventures of Glooskap, whose role as cultural creator demonstrated yet another pattern of heroic development through environmental and social innovation, rather than combat against external enemies. Unlike twin champions focused on eliminating threats or the sea goddess transformed through injustice, his achievements emerged through efforts to create conditions necessary for human communities to flourish in challenging northern territories. Landscape-shaping activities began with recognition that the newly created realm, while beautiful, was not yet optimally arranged for human habitation. Rivers flowed in directions, making transportation difficult. Useful resources were scattered inefficiently, and climate patterns were too extreme for comfortable survival. His work involved not conquest, but intelligent redesign, not domination, but collaboration with natural forces to create better arrangements for all forms of existence, while preserving essential characteristics of original creation. Great dam projects controlling flooding on major river systems revealed engineering capabilities and understanding that heroic action often required long-term thinking and massive construction efforts rather than dramatic individual combat against monsters or supernatural enemies. Work teams included human assistance, animal partners, and cooperation from geological forces, enabling construction projects beyond the scope of ordinary engineering capabilities. Dams they built not only controlled seasonal flooding, but created fish runs, improved navigation, and established water management systems supporting larger populations while maintaining ecological balance. Cultural innovations emerging from his adventures provided equally important contributions to human development in northern regions. Introduction of improved hunting techniques, more efficient fishing methods, and enhanced food preservation technologies increased territorial carrying capacity while reducing effort required for basic survival. Such innovations freed human time and energy for cultural development that would create rich artistic, ceremonial, and intellectual traditions, distinguishing human communities from mere survival-focused animal societies. Prophetic insights he shared revealed understanding that heroic responsibility included preparing communities for challenges that had not yet manifested, but would test their ability to maintain cultural identity while adapting to radically altered circumstances. His predictions addressed coming changes, requiring unprecedented flexibility and wisdom, providing frameworks for understanding how traditional knowledge could be preserved and applied, even when specific situations it originally addressed had been transformed beyond recognition. Vision-seeking traditions, developing throughout much of the continent, created systematic pathways for individuals to develop their own heroic capacities while serving community needs that could not be met through collective effort alone. These were not casual spiritual adventures, but carefully structured rites of passage testing every aspect of character development, while providing frameworks for interpreting whatever guidance might emerge from sincere spiritual seeking under challenging conditions. Preparation required for successful vision-seeking began years before actual wilderness retreats, involving physical conditioning, mental training, and spiritual purification, developing resilience necessary for extended periods of fasting, isolation, and exposure to environmental challenges that would test every aspect of personal character and commitment. Young people learn to control fear responses, maintain mental clarity under stress, and remain open to spiritual communication, even when physical discomfort made concentration extremely difficult. Psychological preparation involved learning to distinguish between genuine spiritual guidance and hallucinations that hunger, thirst, and exhaustion could produce in desperate minds seeking relief from uncomfortable realities. Seekers had to develop discriminating wisdom that could recognize authentic communication from helpful entities while rejecting false messages that psychological stress might create to escape difficult circumstances. Such discernment required understanding differences between what they wanted to experience and what they actually needed to learn. Specific locations chosen for vision-seeking were places where boundaries between ordinary reality and spiritual dimensions were particularly thin, sites where previous seekers had established successful communication with guardian entities, and where geographical features themselves facilitated altered states of consciousness, enabling supernatural encounters. These were often isolated buttes, hidden valleys, or remote lake shores where seekers could remain undisturbed while remaining safe from serious environmental dangers that might interfere with spiritual processes. Guardian entities encountered during successful vision seeking became lifelong partners, providing guidance, protection, and specialized abilities, serving both individual development and community welfare. Animal entities might offer hunting skills, endurance capabilities, or understanding of natural cycles, enabling successful prediction of weather patterns or resource availability. Plant entities could provide healing knowledge, agricultural insights, or pharmaceutical understanding necessary for effective medicine. Celestial entities brought prophetic abilities, leadership qualities, or astronomical knowledge required for accurate calendar keeping and navigation across vast territories. Community integration processes following successful vision seeking ensured that individual spiritual achievements served collective welfare rather than merely personal advancement or recognition. Returning seekers had to demonstrate how their new abilities and insights could benefit their communities, while maintaining humility, preventing spiritual pride from undermining the very gifts they had received. Integration often required additional training from elders possessing experience necessary for helping young people understand and properly use their newly acquired spiritual partnerships. Consequences for those who failed their vision seeking or who misused gifts they received provided sobering reminders about serious nature of spiritual development and potential dangers inherent in supernatural communication without proper preparation or motivation. Some seekers returned from wilderness retreats with no guardian entity contact, failure usually indicating insufficient preparation or motivation, too focused on personal advantage rather than community service. Others made contact with entities whose influence proved harmful rather than helpful, requiring intervention from experienced medicine people to restore proper spiritual balance and prevent ongoing damage. Prophetic traditions emerging from heroic adventures and vision-seeking experiences created frameworks for understanding how individual spiritual development connected to larger cosmic cycles and historical patterns affecting entire peoples over extended time periods. Such prophecies provided guidance for navigating future challenges while maintaining cultural integrity, enabling communities to adapt without losing essential identity. They addressed both immediate practical concerns and ultimate spiritual purposes, offering hope during difficult periods while maintaining realistic understanding of effort required for meaningful positive change. 7 Fires Prophecy of Anishinaabe. People demonstrated how prophetic wisdom could provide practical guidance for historical challenges while maintaining spiritual perspective on ultimate purposes, transcending immediate circumstances. Each fire represented different eras in their people's future development, with specific predictions about challenges they would face and choices determining whether they would thrive or merely survive under changing conditions. Prophecies addressed migration patterns, resource management, relationships with other peoples, technological changes, and spiritual developments, testing commitment to traditional values while requiring adaptive responses to unprecedented situations. Early fires had predicted original migrations from eastern homelands, warning of difficulties while promising that those maintaining spiritual practices would find new territories where they could flourish under different but favorable conditions. Later fires addressed establishment of communities in Great Lakes regions, providing guidance about sustainable relationships with environmental and spiritual forces they would encounter in unfamiliar territories, requiring new approaches to familiar challenges. Middle fires dealt with arrival of light-skinned peoples, bringing both opportunities and threats, testing every aspect of Anishinaabe wisdom and adaptability in ways their ancestors could never have anticipated. Prophecies warned against abandoning traditional practices for seemingly easier approaches offered by newcomers, while acknowledging that some innovations might prove genuinely beneficial if properly integrated with existing knowledge through careful discrimination and testing. Later fires addressed spiritual challenges emerging during periods of rapid change when traditional ways would be disrupted and younger generations might lose connection with understanding their ancestors had preserved through centuries of careful transmission. Prophecies promised that those maintaining relationships with land and spiritual practices would eventually witness renewal of traditional knowledge, combined with beneficial innovations that changing circumstances required for survival and prosperity. Final Fire spoke of choice times when Anishinaabe people would decide whether to continue following ancestral paths or abandon traditional identity for assimilation into dominant cultures surrounding them. Prophecy promised that those choosing traditional paths would play crucial roles in healing not only their own communities, but broader regions damaged by approaches to existence ignoring spiritual dimensions of reality while focusing exclusively on material concerns. Integration of heroic traditions with practical community existence created ongoing expectations that individuals receiving special abilities or insights would use them in service of collective welfare rather than personal advancement or recognition. Heroes were not elevated above their communities, but remained accountable to people whose needs their special abilities were meant to serve. Such accountability prevented development of aristocratic classes, while ensuring that exceptional individuals could contribute their gifts without disrupting social harmony or creating destructive competition for status and resources. Seasonal ceremonies honoring heroic achievements and renewing commitments to heroic values created annual cycles, keeping ideals of courage, service, and spiritual development prominent in community consciousness throughout changing seasons and circumstances. Such observances provided opportunities for individuals to recommit themselves to principles that heroes exemplified, while offering encouragement for those preparing for their own quests and challenges requiring heroic responses. Ultimate teaching, emerging from all heroic traditions, was understanding that every individual possessed potential for heroic development if they were willing to undergo preparation, testing, and service that such development required under any circumstances they might face. Heroes were not born, but made, not chosen by accident, but developed through conscious effort, not gifted with powers, but entrusted with abilities that came with corresponding responsibilities, to serve purposes larger than personal satisfaction or advancement. Heroes whose accounts became foundational for indigenous communities demonstrated that mortal beings could rise to meet cosmic challenges when they aligned individual will with divine purpose, when they chose service over comfort, and when they accepted that true power came through harmony with forces greater than themselves, rather than domination of others. Their examples provided both inspiration and practical guidance for all those who would face their own moments of testing, their own opportunities to serve something greater than personal interest, their own chances to contribute to ongoing work of maintaining balance, enabling conscious existence to flourish in a universe demanding constant choice between creation and destruction. Heroes had slain their monsters, and tricksters had finished reshaping the landscape according to their whims. Yet the cosmos itself demanded something that no individual champion could provide: periodic cleansing that would sweep away whatever had grown stagnant or corrupt in the established order. These were not random disasters striking from malevolent gods, but cosmic adjustments as natural and necessary as the seasonal cycles that governed agriculture and migration. when human societies drifted too far from the reciprocal relationships that sustained all existence, when abundance bred arrogance and prosperity fostered forgetfulness of sacred obligations, the universe would respond with corrections that restored balance through dramatic transformation. Memory of the great waters lived in every indigenous community across the continent, preserved not as distant historical curiosity, but as immediate warning about what happened when people forgot their place in the web of creation. Each nation remembered the deluge through stories that shared essential insights, while reflecting the particular landscapes and circumstances that had shaped their understanding of cosmic justice. In the humid forests of the southeast, Cherokee elders spoke of floods that had risen when human behavior pushed natural tolerance beyond its breaking point. While on the windswept prairies, Mandan storytellers described inundations that followed the disruption of relationships with the buffalo peoples. Cherokee accounts began not with sudden catastrophe, but with gradual erosion of the respectful bonds that had characterized earlier generations' interactions with the natural forces sustaining their communities. Seasons had grown unpredictable over the course of several generations, with droughts extending far beyond normal patterns, followed by storms of unprecedented violence that seemed to announce some fundamental disturbance in the cosmic order. Animals began avoiding human settlements, abandoning territories they had shared peacefully for countless years, while familiar plants struggled to survive in soil that appeared to have lost its vital essence despite showing no obvious signs of damage. Shamans and elders who understood the connections between human conduct and environmental stability repeatedly warned their people that such deterioration represented more than temporary fluctuations in natural cycles. Yet prosperity had made many deaf to warnings that seemed to contradict the evidence surrounding them. Hunting parties returned with more game than their families could use. Fishing expeditions filled nets beyond capacity, and harvest festivals celebrated agricultural abundance that exceeded storage capabilities. Why worry about sustainability when such obvious plenty surrounded them? Individual violations that seemed trivial in isolation began accumulating into patterns that revealed systematic breakdown of reciprocal relationships. Hunters killed far more deer than they could use, leaving carcasses to rot rather than investing effort in proper preservation. Fishermen blocked entire streams with nets that prevented spawning runs, ensuring short-term abundance while destroying future productivity. Farmers cleared forests without considering the animals that depended on those trees, viewing land as empty space, waiting to be improved, rather than as habitats supporting complex communities of relatives. Each broken relationship created small tears in the web, connecting all forms of consciousness. And these tears multiplied faster than natural healing processes could repair them. Animal nations began withdrawing their cooperation from human activities despite continued abundance, making hunting and fishing increasingly difficult through means that defied ordinary explanation. Plant peoples withheld their gifts even from soil that should have supported vigorous growth, causing crop failures that mystified farmers who had followed traditional agricultural practices. Weather spirits responded to this systematic breakdown by sending increasingly severe warnings that disrupted the predictable patterns, enabling seasonal planning and long-term survival strategies. Storms arrived without customary signs, while periods of calm weather lasted so long that communities began assuming dangerous conditions had permanently passed. When the great rains finally began, they came not as seasonal flooding that informed observers could anticipate and prepare for, but as relentless precipitation that continued week after week until even the most experienced weather readers admitted they had never witnessed anything comparable. Waters rose with implacable persistence, first filling valleys and low places, then covering hills. finally reaching heights that submerged even sacred sites positioned on elevated ground, specifically to remain accessible during normal flood cycles. Communities that initially sought refuge on higher ground discovered themselves trapped on shrinking islands, watching helplessly as water levels continued rising beyond anything previous experience suggested possible. Those who survived this great cleansing did so by learning to live according to principles their predecessors had gradually abandoned during times of easy abundance. Isolation on scattered peaks or improvised rafts forced survivors to rediscover the importance of careful resource management, cooperative decision-making, and constant attention to spiritual relationships that prosperity had allowed them to neglect. Individuals who could not adapt to such demanding conditions perished not from rising waters, but from inability to function effectively when genuine wisdom became more important than casual assumptions about natural abundance. When waters finally receded, they revealed landscapes transformed beyond recognition, offering new opportunities for those who approached them with appropriate humility, while demanding unprecedented levels of environmental stewardship. Mandan preservation of similar memories emphasized different aspects of the same cosmic pattern, focusing on how individual choices could accumulate into collective consequences affecting entire regions. Their accounts described a period of unprecedented prosperity, when buffalo herds had grown so vast that successful hunting required minimal skill. Rivers ran thick with fish, and wild plants provided harvests that made agricultural efforts seem almost unnecessary. Rather than fostering gratitude and careful stewardship, however, such abundance bred attitudes of entitlement that gradually eroded spiritual relationships underlying material wealth. Hunting ceremonies that had previously maintained respectful contact with buffalo nations were shortened or eliminated entirely as hunters convinced themselves that personal skill, rather than spiritual cooperation, accounted for their success. Elaborate protocols for approaching medicinal plants were simplified or abandoned as people assumed that healing properties operated automatically rather than requiring ongoing reciprocal relationships. Most dangerously, vision quest traditions that maintained individual connections with guardian spirits fell into neglect as young people decided such demanding practices were unnecessary during times of obvious plenty. Subtle changes in animal behavior and weather patterns that wise observers recognized as warnings were dismissed by most people as temporary fluctuations requiring no particular response. Buffalo herds began avoiding traditional hunting grounds without apparent cause, forcing hunting parties to travel unprecedented distances for increasingly unreliable results. Medicinal plants became difficult to locate in areas where they had previously grown abundantly, while their healing properties seemed diminished even when they could be found. Dreams and visions that had provided guidance for important decisions grew confused and contradictory, leaving communities without reliable access to spiritual insight. Crisis culminated when a group of young hunters decided to demonstrate their prowess by killing an entire buffalo herd, rather than taking only what their community needed. Motivated not by necessity but by desire for recognition, they created spectacular waste that violated every principle governing proper relationship with animal nations. Buffalo peoples, outraged by such senseless destruction, withdrew entirely from the region, leaving human communities facing starvation despite apparent abundance in other forms. Worse, disruption of relationships with buffalo nations created ripple effects throughout the spiritual ecosystem, causing other animal peoples to reconsider their cooperative arrangements with human communities. Whether spirits responded to this breakdown by sending rains that transformed familiar landscapes into endless oceans, unlike natural storms that announced themselves through recognizable signs, These precipitations began without warning and continued without pause until even experienced weather readers acknowledged they faced something beyond all previous experience. Waters rose with relentless determination, covering valleys, hills, and finally even sacred sites that had been positioned specifically to remain accessible during normal flooding. Few who endured the great inundation did so through superior planning or favorable circumstances, but rather by learning to live according to principles that earlier generations had maintained, but that prosperity had encouraged their descendants to abandon. Isolated on shrinking refugees or floating on improvised vessels, survivors rediscovered the vital importance of cooperation, resource sharing, and spiritual practices that abundance had made seem unnecessary. When waters finally receded, revealing landscapes stripped of familiar features, refugees faced the challenge of rebuilding, according to wisdom gained through suffering rather than assumptions inherited from easier times. In the southwestern deserts, where ancient peoples had carved their dwellings into living rock and developed sophisticated understanding of cyclical time, Hopi tradition preserved perhaps the most systematic knowledge of destruction and renewal as regular features of cosmic evolution. Their teachings spoke of previous worlds that had been eliminated when inhabitants failed to fulfill spiritual purposes for which they had been created, with each destruction serving simultaneously as judgment on inadequate performance and preparation for more advanced forms of existence. Earlier worlds had achieved remarkable material success, creating cities that supported large populations while maintaining impressive standards of comfort and security. Yet such achievements had been gained at the cost of spiritual development, as communities became convinced that technological capabilities made spiritual practices unnecessary or counterproductive. Religious ceremonies deteriorated into social occasions lacking genuine spiritual content, while individual relationships with guardian spirits were dismissed as primitive superstitions, incompatible with sophisticated understanding of natural processes. Most fatally, understanding of reciprocal responsibility, connecting human welfare with planetary health, was replaced by attitudes viewing the natural world as a collection of resources awaiting efficient exploitation for human benefit. When spiritual imbalance reached critical proportions, threatening not only human communities, but the integrity of evolutionary processes the Earth was meant to support, cosmic authorities recognized that intervention was necessary to prevent permanent damage. Decisions to end previous worlds through various forms of destruction were made not in anger, but with careful calculation, designed to preserve long-term possibilities for spiritual development. Floods, fires, or other catastrophic events served as both endings and beginnings, destroying what had become corrupt while preparing conditions for more sophisticated forms of existence. Individuals who survived such transitions did so not through superior technology or favorable circumstances, but through maintaining spiritual practices that enabled them to recognize approaching changes and respond appropriately. Their emergence into subsequent worlds required learning to balance material capabilities with spiritual understanding, technological efficiency with ecological sustainability, individual achievement with collective welfare. Hopi understanding of their own existence as a continuing test emphasized that similar spiritual challenges would determine whether their world would endure or require cosmic intervention similar to what had befallen previous worlds. Signs of spiritual imbalance that had preceded earlier destructions were again becoming apparent, suggesting that conscious beings faced another examination of their capacity for wisdom and responsible action. Yet accumulated knowledge from previous cycles provided unprecedented resources for those willing to learn from historical patterns rather than repeating them. Anishinaabe preservation of prophetic tradition through the 7 fires teaching provided detailed guidance for navigating historical and spiritual developments that would test their ability to maintain traditional wisdom while adapting to unprecedented circumstances. Each fire represented both particular challenges and opportunities for demonstrating the viability of indigenous approaches to existence, with accuracy of predictions being demonstrated through complex histories of contact with European peoples and their technologies. Earlier fires had accurately predicted migration patterns, territorial establishments, and arrival of light-skinned peoples who would bring both beneficial innovations and destructive influences, requiring careful discrimination to accept helpful changes while rejecting harmful ones. Later fires addressed spiritual challenges, emerging during periods of rapid social transformation, when traditional ways of life would be disrupted and younger generations might lose connection with ancestral wisdom. Prophecies promised that those maintaining relationships with land and spiritual practices would eventually witness renewal of traditional knowledge, combined with beneficial innovations that changing circumstances required. Final fires spoke of choices that would determine whether Anishinaabe people continued following ancestral paths or abandoned traditional identity for assimilation into dominant cultures surrounding them. Prophecies promised that those choosing traditional paths would contribute crucially to healing not only their own communities, but broader regions damaged by approaches to existence that ignored spiritual dimensions of reality. Fulfillment of these predictions remained in process as communities worked to preserve essential cultural elements while adapting to modern circumstances their ancestors could never have imagined. Star knowledge, preserved by numerous indigenous peoples, provided astronomical frameworks for understanding cyclical processes as manifestations of cosmic patterns operating on scales far exceeding individual lifetimes or particular civilizations. Movement of celestial bodies encoded information about timing of major transitions, while relationships between different astronomical cycles revealed mathematical principles governing cosmic evolution. Such knowledge enabled some communities to anticipate climatic disruptions and implement appropriate preparatory measures, while correlations between celestial configurations and periods of increased instability provided early warning systems for responsive societies. Lakota astronomical understanding connected earthly events with celestial movements through observation techniques, refined over centuries of careful attention to correlations between sky phenomena and terrestrial changes. Star maps recorded not only positions of celestial bodies, but spiritual influences associated with different configurations, enabling prediction of favorable and unfavorable periods for various activities. Buffalo Calf Pipe teachings included astronomical knowledge connecting renewal ceremonies with cosmic cycles, ensuring human activities remained synchronized with larger patterns of cosmic development. Migration stories, preserved by many peoples, encoded astronomical navigation techniques, enabling successful travel across vast territories, without reliance on permanent landmarks that geological or climatic changes might alter. These oral maps used star positions, seasonal changes, and migratory animal behavior to create navigation systems remaining reliable across centuries, while adapting automatically to gradual environmental modifications. Such knowledge proved essential during periods when major disruptions forced communities to relocate quickly, while maintaining cultural continuity. Renewal ceremonies, emerging from understanding of cyclical patterns, created cultural mechanisms for preventing accumulation of spiritual imbalances that might otherwise trigger catastrophic corrections. These observances provided regular opportunities for communities to assess their relationships with spiritual forces, identify problems before they became critical, and implement corrective actions maintaining harmony without requiring external intervention. Sundance traditions exemplified such practices, creating annual cycles of sacrifice and commitment that renewed individual and collective relationships with cosmic forces sustaining existence. Planes, peoples developed these ceremonies to include physical demands, testing participants' dedication, while spiritual dimensions enabled direct communication with influences governing weather, hunting success, and social harmony. Greencorn's ceremonies served similar functions within agricultural contexts, providing annual opportunities for communities to cleanse accumulated spiritual imbalances while celebrating renewal, making continued existence possible. Winter count traditions maintained historical records, enabling communities to track long-term patterns while preserving knowledge about effective responses to recurring challenges. Seasonal timing of renewal ceremonies reflected understanding of periods when boundaries between ordinary reality and spiritual realms became more permeable, enabling enhanced communication and spiritual restoration. Autumn observances might combine harvest celebrations with honoring ancestors who had contributed agricultural knowledge, while winter ceremonies focused on spiritual guidance needed for surviving challenging months, requiring careful resource management and community cooperation. What emerged from all traditions of cyclical destruction and renewal was recognition that conscious beings participated in cosmic evolution through their choices and actions, with individual decisions contributing to collective outcomes that could either advance or impede overall development of consciousness. Catastrophic events were not external punishments, but natural consequences of collective choices violating principles necessary for sustainable existence. Hope embedded in these traditions lay in their promise that conscious beings could learn from catastrophic cycles, developing wisdom and spiritual maturity necessary for maintaining harmony without requiring external correction. Earth itself was understood as conscious entity, capable of supporting increasingly sophisticated forms of existence, but only if inhabitants demonstrated capacity for responsible stewardship and spiritual development. Renewal following each catastrophic cycle offered fresh opportunities for conscious beings to demonstrate such capacity, with each new beginning providing enhanced possibilities for spiritual advancement. Those learning from previous failures could participate in creating civilizations, balancing material capabilities with spiritual understanding, technological efficiency with ecological sustainability, individual achievement with collective welfare. Contemporary relevance of these teachings appeared in their application to modern challenges, threatening to trigger new cycles of catastrophic correction. Similar patterns of spiritual imbalance that had previously necessitated floods, fires, or other forms of cosmic intervention were again accumulating, suggesting that conscious beings faced another test of their capacity for wisdom and responsible action. Yet accumulated knowledge from previous cycles provided unprecedented resources for those willing to learn from historical patterns rather than repeating them, leaving the choice between renewal and destruction dependent on collective decisions of beings who had inherited both ancestral wisdom and responsibility for determining what kind of future their choices would create. When the great waters receded and the cosmic fires burned themselves out, when the heroes had completed their monster-slaying campaigns and the tricksters had finished reshaping the landscape, a profound truth remained that transcended all earthly transformations. Consciousness itself proved indestructible, capable of surviving the dissolution of material forms and continuing its evolution through realms that existed beyond ordinary perception. What others might call death revealed itself as merely another doorway, no more final than the passage from childhood to adulthood, opening onto territories where essence could flourish, freed from the constraints of flesh and bone. Across the great northern plains, where the Milky Way stretched like a luminous highway through the star-drunk darkness, Lakota vision seekers had mapped the route that departing souls would follow when their earthly work was complete. This divine trail was no metaphor spun by grieving minds, but a pathway as real as any buffalo trace, marked by celestial landmarks that guided traveling spirits toward their next phase of existence. When a person's final breath escaped their lips, multiple aspects of their being began a careful separation that had been years in preparation, each element seeking its proper destination in the vast geography of the afterlife. Nagi, the breath soul carrying personal memory and identity, would begin the long trek westward along the star path, while other fragments of consciousness might linger near familiar places or attach themselves to cherished objects that held the imprint of a lifetime's devotion. This journey demanded more than simple navigation skills. It required spiritual preparation that could only be accomplished through a lifetime of proper relationship with the sacred forces governing existence. Those who had lived in harmony with cosmic law found their passage smooth and swift, while those burdened by unresolved conflicts discovered obstacles that demanded resolution before they could proceed. Halfway along the divine trail flowed a great river that separated the territories still touched by earthly concerns from the deeper realms where ancestors dwelt in their transformed state. Only a single log bridged these rushing waters, its surface worn smooth by countless spiritual crossings, so narrow that perfect balance became essential for safe passage. Here the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime revealed its true value, as souls who had cultivated spiritual equilibrium during their material existence stepped confidently across, while those still heavy with earthly attachments found themselves tumbling into the swift current below. Yet even failure at this crossing carried its own mercy. Souls who fell discovered themselves not destroyed, but transported to intermediate territories, where they could continue the spiritual work that life had left unfinished. Divine teachers and previously departed relatives waited in these healing spaces, offering guidance and support that enabled continued growth under conditions more favorable than the harsh testing ground of earthly existence. No soul was abandoned or condemned. Each was given whatever time and assistance it needed to complete its preparation for the higher realms. Beyond the bridge stretched territories of such beauty and harmony that earthly language could offer only pale approximations of their reality. Here the successfully departed lived in forms that preserved their essential identity, while eliminating the physical limitations and emotional burdens that had constrained their previous existence. These transformed beings maintained active interest in their earthly relatives, serving as guides and protectors whose influence could still touch material events when proper ceremonial channels remained open between the realms. Vision quests and sweat lodge ceremonies could temporarily thin the barriers separating the living from their departed kin, creating opportunities for direct communication that provided both comfort and practical guidance. Families who maintained these spiritual connections through appropriate rituals found themselves supported by accumulated ancestral wisdom that could help them navigate challenges no individual knowledge could address. Those who neglected these relationships, however, cut themselves off from resources that might prove essential during times of crisis or difficult decision-making. Far to the southwest, where red mesa walls caught fire in the setting sun, and ancient dwellings carved from living rock bore witness to vanished civilizations, hopey understanding painted an entirely different picture of the soul's post-mortem destination. Rather than journeying to distant star realms, departed spirits returned to the underworld from which all life had originally emerged, completing a cosmic circle that transformed ending into renewal. This return represented not retreat, but homecoming, as spirits brought the accumulated wisdom of earthly experience back to the source of all creative power. Elaborate ceremonies guided this homeward journey, transforming what other peoples might view as loss into celebration of completion and new beginning. When properly conducted, these rituals help departing souls release their attachments to material existence while preserving the essential learning that would serve their new role as Kachinas, divine beings whose ongoing work maintained the cosmic balance, enabling life to flourish throughout the universe. Each returned spirit would undergo transformation that expanded rather than diminished their capabilities, gaining access to powers and knowledge that had been beyond their reach during physical embodiment. As Kachinas, these transformed ancestors continued their involvement in human affairs through the elaborate ceremonial cycles that brought divine energy into material manifestation. Masked dancers who had undergone proper purification and training could temporarily embody Kachina presence, creating rain clouds, healing sickness, resolving conflicts, and blessing communities that maintained appropriate relationships with both the natural world and the spirit realm. Success in these ceremonies depended not merely on technical skill, but on the spiritual readiness of entire communities to receive and properly utilize the gifts their ancestors offered. In the eastern woodlands, where cathedral forests filtered sunlight into dancing patterns and streams sang their way toward distant seas, Cherokee tradition described the Nightland as a parallel realm coexisting with ordinary reality, but separated by barriers that normally prevented direct interaction between the two dimensions. Departed souls continued their existence in communities remarkably similar to those they had known during life, engaging in familiar activities while freed from the sufferings and limitations that characterized material existence. Transition to the Nightland occurred gradually rather than instantaneously, with newly departed souls spending several days in the vicinity of their former homes, observing family reactions and participating in funeral ceremonies that would complete their separation from earthly attachments. During this liminal period, they could sometimes be perceived by living relatives who possessed sufficient spiritual sensitivity to recognize their presence, creating opportunities for final communications that provided both comfort and practical guidance. When departure time finally arrived, divine guides would meet the soul at the banks of the great river, separating the realm of the living from the territories of the dead, providing assistance appropriate to the spiritual development each individual had achieved during their lifetime. Those who had lived in harmony with Cherokee values received warm welcomes and immediate integration into Nightland communities, while those who had violated important principles might require periods of instruction and healing before they could fully participate in their new existence. Yet even the Nightland maintained permeable boundaries that skilled medicine people could cross during spirit journeys undertaken for healing or guidance purposes. These dangerous expeditions required extensive preparation and carried significant risks, but successful shamanic travelers could return with knowledge and power that benefited their entire communities. Dreams provided another pathway for communication, as Nightland dwellers could visit their living relatives during sleep to offer warnings, guidance, or comfort during times of particular need. Thousands of miles to the north, where ice and aurora painted the polar sky in colors that had no earthly names, Inuit shamans had developed perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of consciousness after death, recognizing that multiple souls inhabited each human being during life and followed different destinies when physical existence ended. These various aspects of being, some carrying memory and identity, others connected to specific places or relationships, required different treatments and faced different challenges during their post-mortem journeys. Shamanic training, among Arctic peoples included extensive mapping of the spiritual territories that souls would encounter after death. Knowledge gained through dangerous spirit travels that enabled experienced practitioners to visit these realms while maintaining their connections to physical existence. These explorations revealed a complex landscape of spiritual regions, each offering appropriate conditions for souls with particular characteristics and needs. Some areas provided opportunities for continued learning and growth, while others offered rest and healing for spirits that had endured particularly difficult earthly experiences. More importantly, shamanic understanding included techniques for soul retrieval that addressed illnesses resulting from the loss or capture of essential aspects of consciousness. When serious sickness or psychological disturbance indicated that part of a patient's soul had become separated from their physical body, skilled shamans could undertake rescue missions into the same territories that souls would encounter after death. These healing journeys required not only supernatural traveling abilities, but diplomatic skills for negotiating with potentially hostile spirits, and the physical endurance necessary to complete round-trip expeditions between the realm of the living and various afterworld territories. Success in such missions depended on years of training that typically began in childhood, with experiences demonstrating unusual sensitivity to spiritual realities. Potential shamans might receive visits from spirit guides, experience prophetic dreams, or display abilities to perceive events occurring at great distances. This initial sensitivity required development through apprenticeships that taught complex techniques for safe travel in non-ordinary reality, including methods for recognizing helpful versus harmful spirits and maintaining sufficient spiritual protection to survive encounters with dangerous entities. Throughout indigenous North America, sacred bundle traditions provided systematic approaches for maintaining ongoing relationships with deceased relatives while accessing the guidance and protection they could offer from their transformed state. Each bundle represented years or decades of careful accumulation and spiritual preparation, containing objects that had belonged to departed family members or that had been specially empowered to serve as communication devices between the realm of the living and the territories of the dead. Proper care and use of these bundles required extensive knowledge of ceremonial protocols governing communication with ancestor spirits, as well as personal maintenance of the spiritual purity necessary for effective intermediary work. Bundle keepers who preserved appropriate relationships with their departed relatives could receive guidance covering every aspect of community life, from hunting and agricultural decisions to conflict resolution and marriage arrangements. Access to this ancestral wisdom often proved essential for solving problems that individual knowledge alone could not address. Burial practices throughout the continent reflected sophisticated understanding of each soul's needs during transition from physical to spiritual existence. Some traditions emphasized providing departing spirits with objects and provisions that would assist their journey to ancestral territories, while others focused on ceremonies designed to help souls release earthly attachments and embrace their new spiritual condition. Orientation of graves often reflected beliefs about the direction spirits would travel after leaving physical bodies, while timing of burial ceremonies took advantage of astronomical or seasonal conditions that would facilitate successful transitions. Mourning practices served multiple functions beyond providing emotional support for grieving families. Extended mourning periods included specific rituals designed to assist departing souls' journeys, while the conclusion of formal mourning marked establishment of new relationships between the living and the dead that would continue throughout their remaining lifetimes. Taboos and restrictions surrounding death reflected understanding of spiritual dynamics involved in consciousness transitions, with certain foods avoided and specific activities prohibited to prevent interference with delicate processes of transformation. Dreams and visions occurring during mourning periods were understood as communications from departing spirits, providing reassurance about successful transitions while offering final guidance to living relatives. These experiences required careful interpretation by qualified spiritual advisors who could distinguish between genuine spirit communication and psychological projections that grief might create. Annual ceremonies honoring deceased relatives created ongoing opportunities for maintaining connections with ancestor spirits, while celebrating continuing bonds linking the living and the dead. Seasonal timing of these ancestor ceremonies often reflected beliefs about periods when boundaries between ordinary reality and spirit realms became more permeable, enabling enhanced communication between dimensions. Autumn festivals might combine harvest celebrations with honoring ancestors who had contributed agricultural knowledge, while winter ceremonies focused on spiritual guidance needed to survive challenging months when communities relied on stored resources and careful planning. Teaching functions served by ancestor veneration extended far beyond religious observance to encompass practical instruction in survival skills, social values, and cultural knowledge. Stories told about deceased relatives preserved crucial information about historical events, environmental changes, and successful strategies for dealing with recurring challenges. Guidance received from ancestor spirits provided frameworks for making decisions that individual wisdom alone might prove insufficient to address. What emerged from all indigenous traditions concerning death and afterlife was recognition that consciousness itself constituted the fundamental reality underlying all material manifestations. Physical existence represented not the primary form of being, but one phase in awareness's ongoing evolution toward ever greater understanding and integration with cosmic forces sustaining all reality. Territories awaiting souls after physical death were not distant rewards or punishments, but immediate realities interpenetrating the world of the living while remaining normally invisible to ordinary perception. Ancestors dwelling in spiritual realms continued active participation in their descendants' lives, while pursuing their own ongoing development in forms freed from material constraints. Practices developed for maintaining communication with ancestor spirits created rich spiritual ecosystems where guidance, healing, and protection flowed continuously between the world of the living and territories of the dead. These connections provided not only comfort and practical assistance, but constant reminders that individual existence formed part of a much larger fabric of consciousness, transcending apparent boundaries of birth and death. Generations of careful attention to spiritual realities revealed profound insights into consciousness itself and possibilities awaiting all beings willing to undertake ongoing spiritual development. Death appeared not as termination, but transformation. Not ending, but continuation. Not separation, but deeper integration into the cosmic community, embracing all forms of conscious existence. What seemed like loss revealed itself as graduation to expanded awareness, while apparent finality dissolved into recognition of eternal cycles connecting all consciousness in relationships that no physical dissolution could destroy. Consciousness had journeyed through creation and destruction, through heroic quests and trickster transformations, yet the greatest miracle remained not in any single tale, but in the persistence of the telling itself. Across centuries of upheaval that would have silenced lesser traditions, these accounts continued to flow from elder lips to eager ears, carrying within their ancient rhythms all the accumulated wisdom needed to navigate an ever-changing world. They were not museum pieces preserved in amber, but living currents of understanding that adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their essential power to guide, heal, and remind human beings of their place in the great web of existence. Winter lodges had always been the universities of indigenous North America, where snow-locked months provided opportunity for the deep teaching that could not be accomplished during active seasons. Master storytellers understood that careless transmission could distort essential meanings, so particular accounts could only be shared during specific seasons when celestial configurations created proper receptivity. Summer stories taught practical skills for immediate survival, while winter narratives addressed deeper mysteries requiring contemplative understanding. Sacred narratives demanded even more careful handling, with some restricted to ceremonial contexts, and others requiring years of preparation before listeners could receive them without spiritual harm. When European contact created unprecedented challenges, indigenous teachers proved remarkably adaptable while preserving essential principles. Mission schools and government boarding institutions that attempted to eliminate cultural transmission found themselves confronting traditions far more resilient than expected. Children forbidden to speak native languages developed coded ways of preserving knowledge through seemingly innocent activities. Games that appeared harmless actually taught traditional geography, seasonal observations, and social protocols. Songs carried complex mnemonics preserving astronomical data, historical chronologies, and ceremonial instructions. Grandmothers denied direct access to grandchildren found ways to transmit crucial teachings through brief encounters. Beadwork patterns carried maps, calendars, and ceremonial diagrams that could be consulted throughout life without attracting hostile attention. Some communities preserved traditions by concealing them within imposed religious and educational structures, infusing Christian ceremonies with indigenous meanings while supplementing academic subjects with traditional knowledge. Prison systems that incarcerated traditional leaders discovered that confinement often strengthened cultural transmission. Forced proximity enabled intensive teaching that might have taken years under normal circumstances, while shared hardship created bonds, ensuring careful preservation of knowledge. Many effective 20th century indigenous teachers credited their time in federal prisons with providing the focused study that prepared them for leadership roles. Urban relocation programs that scattered families across distant cities inadvertently created networks for cultural exchange, crossing traditional tribal boundaries. Powwow traditions emerging from this mixing created new forms of expression that honored diversity while celebrating shared indigenous identity. Rather than eliminating tribal distinctiveness, these developments strengthened appreciation for unique traditions by providing context for comparison and mutual learning. Academic institutions studying indigenous cultures offered unexpected preservation opportunities. Legal systems began acknowledging traditional knowledge in cases establishing fishing and hunting rights, often relying on oral traditions that preserved detailed records of historical relationships with territories. Environmental movements discovered powerful allies among communities whose practices embodied sustainability principles that environmentalists struggled to articulate. Climate change research gradually recognized that oral traditions contained environmental records spanning far longer periods than written documentation. Traditional weather prediction methods proved remarkably accurate when evaluated using modern meteorological understanding. Political movements for self-determination drew strength from governance systems, offering alternatives to both colonial structures and mainstream institutions. Educational institutions developed by indigenous communities created new models integrating traditional knowledge with contemporary disciplines. Language immersion programs combining storytelling with modern techniques proved effective at preserving endangered languages. Technology proved adaptable to indigenous purposes. Digital recording preserved traditional songs and ceremonies. Computer databases organized ecological knowledge, and internet communications connected scattered communities. Contemporary indigenous writers publishing traditional stories reached audiences beyond their communities while maintaining cultural integrity. Visual artists revitalized traditional techniques through programs connecting elder artists with younger students. Musicians combining traditional songs with contemporary instruments created new forms attracting young people who might otherwise remain disconnected from their heritage. Medical systems began recognizing traditional healing practices and seeking integration with contemporary healthcare. Agricultural researchers discovered that traditional farming techniques often produced better long-term results while requiring fewer external inputs. Urban planning initiatives found that traditional ecosystem knowledge could inform development projects, reducing environmental impact. Economic development, drawing on traditional knowledge, created opportunities for communities to participate in contemporary markets while maintaining cultural integrity. Tourism that respectfully showcased indigenous cultures created revenue streams supporting preservation, while educating visitors about continuing vitality. Yet beneath all contemporary adaptations, the essential power remained unchanged from when Raven first scattered light and Sky Woman fell through the world to begin creation on Turtle's back. In courtrooms defending indigenous rights, creation stories established cultural connections to territories stretching back to time's beginning. In environmental campaigns, traditional knowledge revealed the sacred character of landscapes others viewed as economic resources. In healing centers, traditional stories provided frameworks for understanding suffering and pathways toward restoration. Children born into the 21st century found in ancient stories guidance remaining as relevant as ever. Heroic journeys provided models for navigating educational systems, honoring both individual potential and community needs. Trickster stories taught flexibility essential for surviving bureaucratic pressures. Vision Quest traditions offered meaningful alternatives to mainstream coming-of-age experiences. Elders who survived boarding schools and cultural suppression found themselves sought by younger generations, hungry for preserved knowledge. Language revitalization programs, bringing together elder speakers with young learners, created intergenerational connections, healing wounds from forced disruption. What emerged was not nostalgic recreation, but creative adaptation of living traditions to contemporary realities, honoring essential principles while embracing beneficial innovations. As the new millennium progressed, indigenous traditions revealed themselves not as disappearing remnants, but as vital resources for species survival. Climate change, environmental degradation, and spiritual alienation had been anticipated in traditional prophecies that also provided guidance for restoration. Ancient stories that sustained communities through centuries of oppression now offered hope and practical wisdom for all humans facing challenges conventional worldviews seemed unable to address. In this way, the great circle of story returned to its beginning, for the same creative forces that brought forth the first world from primordial darkness continued operating through every generation, choosing to listen, learn, and carry forward the sacred responsibility of maintaining proper relationships with all beings sharing existence. Stories lived because they were lived, because they continued providing what they always had. Guidance for conscious beings seeking to fulfill their role in the great ongoing creation that had no beginning and would have no end, as long as voices remained to speak the stories and hearts prepared to receive them.